Hello and welcome to another episode of Combat Analysis of Chivalry Medieval Warfare, where we take a look at hostile engagements, analyze them, and talk about ways to improve our playstyle. My name is Marcus and I'm your host this evening. This episode is a bit experimental, as it's using 1440p at 100 FPS footage, as opposed to the 1080 at 60 FPS recordings I've been using for my other videos. My goal with this is simply to improve the slow motion quality, as I can make 50 and 25 FPS slow motion instead of 30 and 15, and that should make it a lot smoother. This is of course very demanding on the system, and I can only get it to work properly on so many maps, Dark Forest being one of the more favourable, and we are gonna look at a session from there in a bit. But first, let's jump into a different game, which I played by myself on Cove. The nice thing about this match is there are no archers at all. They are disabled, and that is also why I choose not to go with the shield. We're not going to look at the very first fight of this game, because it is by all accounts rather dull. However, the next one is a bit more interesting. We've sort of just cleared the area around the cannon, and I've left Secresta behind to load it, while I go ahead and help our team. They have quite a numbers advantage, and it's not helped by the fact that my two allies are caught right in the middle of the enemy. I think the first big mistake I make is to attack the knight in front of me. What I really need to do is to get the attention of as many of the Agathians as possible, and steer them away from my team. I'm in a great position and can definitely afford to fight two opponents at the same time, if that means my allies are relieved some of the pressure, and more importantly, only have to fight on one front at a time. The ideal additional target is the van on the left, who just like the knight is quite close to me and wants to engage my teammates. I think I would still be forced to initiate on the knight, because the van seems to run out of reach in time for the first attack, but I definitely should have target switched onto the van right after stabbing the knight. I could then circle back out of the danger zone and hope that they would attempt to engage me from there. This would buy my allies a little more time to live, and in turn grant me a better chance of getting out of here alive. Instead I choose to stay on the knight, and despite my decent drag attempt, he parries and strafes so far to the left that I can no longer see all my opponents. I try to parry the incoming stab, but don't realize quickly enough that the van is also swinging at me, after having killed my one remaining ally. So I burn the parry on that attack alone, and take heavy damage from the Sword of War stab. I make an aggressive attempt by winding up shortly after, but have to feint the parry as he swings at me as well. Here I'm quite certain the Spear Guard is going to attack me, so instead of riposting the Clay Guard, I target switch onto him instead. He runs past without a care in the world, and this royally fucks my stamina pool. I think the decision to retreat and follow the Spear Guard is the right move. I don't want to push forward into the enemy and towards their spawn point while at a stamina disadvantage. Retreating gives me a chance to score another backstab hit and possibly get assistance from my teammates. I do end up helping Secresta out by eliminating one of his attackers, but sadly I am not as lucky. The Clay Guard I was fighting earlier catches up to me, and while I may have been able to kill him as well had I not gotten assistance, I end up dying to the next Vanguard who charges through me. The fight was difficult to begin with, as we started at a numbers disadvantage and I carry a weapon with a relatively high HDK. The situation is further complicated by inadequate target choices and inefficient stamina usage. I don't think it was a bad move per se to target switch onto the Spear Guard, because given the initial conditions it was very likely he'd be trying to attack me. So I wouldn't necessarily change my decision. It's just an explanation for why things went wrong in this case. The next engagement is fairly sizable, involving a lot of different players. On my initial stab I feel like I'm not quite in range, so I decide to feint it, and since he continues his combo I go down the safer route of safety parrying. This time I'm in a better position and manage to hit him in recovery, but then I'm forced to feint a parry as the Vanguard swings at me. I make a successful target switch, delete the knight from the fight, and proceed to dodge the incoming stab from the second knight. At this point I'm quite happy to fall back for a sec, as I have depleted some of my stamina and don't seem to have many allies pushing forward anyway. The Vanguard charging in is my cue to reinitiate. Our opponents are fully focused on him, which gives me a great opening on them. I get a great stab on the Vanguard and choose to target switch onto the man at arms, but by the time my attack lands, another ally has gotten in the way, and while I smack him with my sword, he smacks both the man at arms and our ally, resulting in both their deaths. When another one of my allies run him, I try to follow up and counter when they bite into him. Since there are so many, I actually cancel my combo to be able to parry, despite not seeing any attacks. Since I didn't follow up on my feint immediately, I have to feint again to make sure I get through the knight's defense. And I keep playing very cautiously, by cancelling again. I see a potential target in the Vanguard who launches at Cresta, but again decide not to engage. Basically I'm trying to kite again here and strike back mid-combo or in recovery. But the knight chooses to stab Cresta instead, and is out of reach of me when I turn around. Here I miss again, but since no one is actively paying attention to me, I feel comfortable following through with my combo. I manage to parry the reverse, and because of his lack of vision, he panics and I score a free hit. He misparries in the middle of my combo and dies to the second strike. I chase around the cannon to attack from behind, but I'm caught off guard by his stab. When I eventually do wind up myself, he panics, and I keep the flow going with a feint into final stab. I draw away from the fight to inspect the other cannon, failing to realize the objective is virtually completed anyway. On my way there I run into one last enemy. He winds up again after my successful parry and dies. After everything is said and done, I have made it through everything alive, but I can still see huge improvements to be made, so let's talk about them. Right off the bat, I wind up too early. It would have been much better to hit the guy in recovery after the very first attack. Instead I ended up out of reach, had to safety parry the second hit, which led to my allied man-at-arms dying on the third. I'm sure you can see how keeping the man-at-arms alive and killing the knight more quickly would drastically change the course of this fight. Anyway, I think this part is pretty solid, and even backing off here is fine. I do however wish I would have reinitiated a little sooner when I saw my Vanguard charging in. The next mistake is cancelling this overhead directed at the man-at-arms. There's clearly no need to feint here, as it's not looking my way at all. By the time my next attack rolls around, I'm blocked by valet number 2. And chances are that said ally wouldn't have killed our valet number 1 if I had taken care of the man-at-arms sooner. Here you can see I try to hit both Vanemy 1 and 2 with my stab, but fail on the second target. This is quite sad, as the second van is one hit from dying, and would have been deleted from the fight entirely. The next problem is that I don't follow up on the feint. Now I know that while I played, this feint was a defensive measure, but that's ridiculous, because no one in this frame is attempting to attack me. Feinting is however a very good way to continue the fight, but it should have been used aggressively, not defensively. I end up doing this eventually, but 15 stamina shorter. You can see I actually tried to target switch onto Vanemy 2 here, but the knight moves to the side to dodge my attack, and I run a clear one straight into the hit. Here I think feinting and backing off is way too passive. I should probably not feint at all, since I've done it so much already, and it becomes both predictable and stamina inefficient. There's also not that many opponents to worry about, and I really need to start laying in damage instead. Here I again withdraw from a perfect opportunity to attack. I just run in and feint defensively and back off. Even using the feint aggressively would have been fine, as I did fall for it, but I would have preferred if I just attacked normally. Another option, if I had kept a better eye at the surroundings, would be to run after Vanemy 1 as soon as the halberd van parried. He was running off into the house and could have been an easy kill from behind. While the thought of dodging attacks like I'm doing here is nice, it really doesn't amount to anything when I keep being out of reach and missing my own attacks. Now the reason why I don't immediately attack the van who gets charged from behind is because I'm scared of the knight's stab. I continue to clumsily bump into the cannon, but as I said before, I feel comfortable continuing my combo, as no one is actively engaging me. Here I do respond quite well and parry the incoming reverse, and I'm happy to say that I forego feinting for once, wait for his panic parry and continue with my overhead, as I know his parry is in recovery. I think that's about it for this fight. Overall, way too cautious and passive plays from me. I did do a stupid amount of defensive feints that were interpreted as aggressive that I could have avoided entirely or at least capitalized on. The next fight I'd like to look at takes place a bit later, on the second objective. I think the first issue is that I don't start moving to help my teammate fast enough. As soon as my stamina is full, I should start engaging the enemy. My initiation is quite good. The Van doesn't appear to see me before I stab him. I follow up with a feint and he dies to the subsequent stab. Not sure if he overread it or simply blacked out completely after my first hit. I am, however, quite fortunate that the knight doesn't intervene at any point, as he instead turns towards Zakresta, who's approaching from the other side. He falls for Zakresta's stab feint, which opens up for both our attacks, and being surrounded by 3 opponents, he's unable to parry my final overhead. Once I'm no longer worried about the Vanguard charge, I can make my approach, and do an alt slash to avoid hitting my allies. My one complaint here is that I should have landed at least one of the hits in his head, as that would have ensured a 2-hit to kill, but he dies fairly quickly anyway. Here I'm anticipating another charge, and try to circle around till I see where his attack lands. I go in when out of harm's way, and I'm actually quite surprised he had time to parry me here, as he didn't feint to parry. I want to avoid the Van's overhead again, and hit him in recovery, but this postpones my attack long enough that I'm now in danger of getting attacked by his other allies, and I don't want that to happen in the middle of my strike. So I ultimately decide to give up on the Van and turn my attention towards the knight. As soon as he starts winding up, I circle around and try to force out a CFTP. He moves adequately in response and I miss the first attack. The overhead does hit him, but afterwards I'm forced to feint to parry the Vanguard. I decide to go for the target switch, but I wish I would have made it slightly less obvious that this was my intention. Basically I should have been facing more to the right to make the knight believe I was indeed trying to drag my stab around the Van's parry, and then made a hard left turn and hit the knight instead. I eventually kill the Van with a side stab and turn towards the next target. Since I'm now quite low on stamina, I make effective use of what's left by baiting out his parry with a jump. But I get blocked by my ally and have to back off for a sec. After the parry, I nod at him to bait out another attack. It works out flawlessly, and I finish him off thereafter. It's paramount that I work with stabs here, as that is by far the easiest way to get a 2-hit kill on a Vanguard. This guy seems to be the last one on their side to spawn in this house before we claim it. And once he's dead, this engagement is for all intents and purposes over. The one thing that stands out to me in this fight is how much team damage I took. 2 hits from Zakresta and 2 from Fabian. Things get messy in war, I suppose. Otherwise I don't think I made any grave mistakes. My tempo and stamina usage was a lot better than in the previous fight, and I didn't take a single hit from my enemies. Let's look at one final fight before we move on to the next match. When the knight starts swinging, I circle round in the traditional fashion. He ends up feinting the attack, and loses a little bit of stamina. After I parry, Sakrasta stabs in Risi's direction but misses, which renders him defenseless against my attack. I feint my next overhead, but since he's not facing our way, he doesn't fall for it. Meanwhile, Sakrasta gets taken out by our friend at the ballista. After parrying the maul again, I turn around because I know a Vanguard's been headed our way for some time, and I do so just in time to parry him. This time I do a better target switch, and with the help of another overhead feint, I eliminate Risi from the field of battle. I strafe, lean back and score a hit on the man-at-arms in recovery, while keeping the Van busy with safety parrying. I managed to outpace the man-at-arms with a reverse overhead, and even though I missed the Van with this attack, I flinch him with a stab right after. At this point I need a breather, as I'm almost empty on stamina. But I also do not want to wait too long. This Van is only one hit away from dying himself, and at this point he should be fairly intimidated and prone to make mistakes. So I gather enough stamina that I have room for a miss or similar mistake, run in and bait out an attack. I know that he's skilled enough to be able to CFTP, but I also know people are very prone to falling for feints while feinting to parry, as they have to devote a lot of brain resources to the act and neglect other things in turn. I managed to get through his parry, end his life, and get out of recovery in time to parry the next guy looking for an early grave. He gambles on my overhead and bites the dust, marking the end of this engagement. Naturally I shouldn't have much to say about this fight, as I killed 4 guys and came out alive, but I can see at least one missed opportunity, and that is to target switch after the first stab on Risi. The Master of Medieval Spirit actually runs right into striking distance from me with throwables drawn, and I could have easily directed the overhead at him instead to kill him while he was unable to parry. Aside from that, it was a great engagement for me. I avoided unnecessary parries, remained aware of my surroundings, refrained from missing altogether, and applied pressure in key situations. It is time to say goodbye to Cove and the matches I played there. In case anyone is interested, it ended as a loss. We never made it past the second objective. But just as I hinted in the opening scene of this episode, I have one more match to show. Much like the first game, it was completely archer free, but I decided to drop the Sword of War in favor of the halberd. Let's start at the beginning. I'm off to a great start with what's essentially a backstab on Sunny, and move up to keep on assisting Urti in his engagements. I am unsure if he failed to parry because he was still in recovery, or simply didn't react in time. Either way, Urti ends up serving me 3 kills on a silver platter, and for that I am grateful. I'm going to let the recording speak for itself for a while, and I'll go over a few points I want to make afterwards. I was quite surprised I died to this attack alone, and after looking up the damage numbers, I found that my intuition was right. A fire pot is supposed to deal 30 damage, and a greatsword overhead in the head 68, and I'm quite confident I didn't stand around in the fire at all. So it seems quite clear that this is one of those cases where the fire pot mechanic is a bit wonky. Oh well. Let's break the fight down into segments and go through it one part at a time. Step 1. What do we say to death? Here I spot the large wave of enemies approaching and realize my allies are few. So I make the decision not to engage directly and try an alternate route. This is good. But what I could do in addition is to take a quick sweep of my surroundings to get an update on where the rest of my team is and if they are likely to show up at any point in the future. Step 2. A new dawn. Hypo notices my approach and burns my breeches. I try to dodge the pods, but due to the nature of projectiles, you can never do better than an educated guess. In my hovering motion, I spot a group of newly arrived allies, and decide to rejoin the larger engagement. Again, I think this is the right decision, because given my past experiences, I should both be more likely to survive and contribute more to the team in a 4v4 matchup than in a 1v1 against a similarly skilled man-at-arms who also plays at an HP advantage. At this point, things are looking up for us. Step 3. The bisection of the right flank. Hope is short-lived, as two of my allies decide to circle around the stone, and this weakens our position. We had every chance in the world for a strong line of defense, with the building to the right, the stone and the tree all narrowing the path, but this opportunity quickly goes away. I want to capitalize on every single move they make on my teammate, and things start rather well as Intox launches at him, target switches to me but misses, and I hit her in recovery. But here we've already broken up into two different duels instead. My matchup is fairly even, but Sani clearly has an advantage over Boogie, and I need this meat shield to stay alive. There's nothing inherently wrong with the follow-up reverse slash I do. It's stamina efficient and has a decent chance of bypassing parries. But it is not the most time efficient way of finishing an opponent. The clock is ticking. In theory, Sani should be able to kill Boogie very quickly, and as you may already know, this is exactly what happens. The path forward is completely unguarded, which lets Hypo join in as well. Now I have 3 competent parries swinging at me, and any momentum I may have had up until this point has completely vanished. I've already put myself in a terrible position. The way I see it, there were 2 ways out of this. I should have either target switched from Intox onto Sani after the first stab, to break Sani's momentum and buy time for Boogie. I would at least have had time to stop his final attack from landing. But there is a problem with this approach as well. I would be quite likely to put myself in a 3-way sandwich, with a Battlefront behind me, Sani on one side and Intox on another. So a more refined approach would have been to focus on killing Intox super quickly, for instance by feinting the slash and killing her thereafter, maybe even by spamming Q if that's what it took. This would clean up our backline and let us focus forward instead. No matter what happened to Boogie, I would have one opponent less to worry about. I could also claim her position and backtrack around the rock in the event that I got overwhelmed by my opponents. This would move me closer to the rest of my team and zone my opponents into my field of view. Step 4. An abrupt end. Here I have multiple attacks flying in my general direction. And to continue where I left off on my last point, you can see that this knight actually makes a good attempt to help me out. But since I'm forced to backtrack away from my allies, it takes him a long time to catch up to us. I can't really fault myself for what happens next. I do a good job of parrying the incoming attacks, and I make sure not to stay idle by immediately countering with a riposte that lines up with 2 of my opponents. Neither can I fault myself for parrying in response to a Hypo stab. In the short window I had to decide whether or not to parry, I think it definitely looked like it was gonna hit, and if I were put in the same situation again, I would have done the same thing. As my body falls to the ground, my ally makes contact and draws the attention of both Hypo and Intox. So if only I had had a little more HP, enough to survive the singular overhead, the fight could have ended in a very different fashion. I guess what I want to make clear is that, even though I died in the 4th segment, I wouldn't necessarily change anything I did there. I did my parries and my riposte and there wasn't much room to do anything else. Instead I would look to change things up the chain. The firepot put me at a disadvantage from the start. It was crucial that I ended my duel with Intox quickly, or postponed the death of my ally, so as not to end up in a 2 or 3v1 away from the rest of my team later down the line. Well, let's not dwell on this fight for too long, and move on to another one that takes place on the same objective, but a couple minutes later. Here you could maybe make a case for taking the left route, as it might get a bit cramped in the middle, but at the same time both Silo and this other guy look pretty beat up, I might just want to step back from the fights anyway. Ultimately, I ended up going down the middle lane. I think I should have responded quicker here and prepared to hit the knight in recovery. Given that my ally was completely oblivious and trying to run away, and the other guy was swinging to my left, he was probably gonna knock my ally in that direction, and I should therefore move up on the right side and hit him when I have a clear shot. He ends up getting flinched by Urzi anyway, and I can follow up easily thereafter. I do so with a dragged overhead, and follow up with another one to guarantee maximum damage output. Then I run into some invisible fire and safety parry the Vanguard. Here I safety parry his slash and then misses again. And he spins around and appears to completely lose track of everything, so I just go for a stab. In hindsight, I wish I had actually feinted the parry here, as his attack got really close to hitting me in the end. Luckily, it did not. By now we've cleaned up most of the enemy and we try to reset and prepare for the next wave. And this is where things start to get a bit more interesting. Right here I would like to pause and mention that I think I should be moving more to the left and get up on the left side of this knight. All of these three guys seem to be fairly ready to attack him. And then Intox is probably gonna want to move in this direction, which means I'll have to find a different entry point, or I'll end up hitting her in the back. Then take into account the left trajectory bias of the halberd, and suddenly there are several things advocating for me positioning to the left. This kind of ends up happening anyway, as Sunny drags his slash far and wide to bypass the knight's parry, but that's more of a lucky coincidence than good thinking from me. Here you will also see the first of many misses in this fight, and it is quite detrimental to my tempo. Now I decide to go for a feint in hope of opening up for both mine and Urzi's attack, but while my attack goes through, he slants too early and feeds a riposte, so instead of continuing my combo, I'm forced to parry this. I try for a feint again, but this time he manages to read it. He goes for a similar play, but I too can keep my composure. As I go for the parry, Sunny dies to the Van on my left. I throw a little panic parry out, but as soon as the Van swings out of reach again, I try to hit him in recovery, but here I misdirect my stab terribly and damage my ally instead. The next problem is that I don't combo, which means my next attack is delayed to the point where I have to back off so as not to get hit by the Van's own slash, and therefore I end up missing again, all the while getting nicely burnt to a crisp in the fire. This time I do combo and hit the Van with my overhead, but it stays alive, and the next stab in my combo misses again, and this time it hits the rock, which withdraws my permission to combo again. I run after the guy, and as he goes into recovery after his swing, I can wind up yet again and thankfully manage to end his life. At this point my reserves are quite empty, so I try to withdraw from the fight and replenish my stamina. Hypo pops out of nowhere and tries to murder me. I get the parry out just in time. Then I continue with a super clumsy jump. There's absolutely no reason to do this here. In fact, Hypo almost runs out of reach for me, since I'm flying in the wrong direction. But I clip him at the end and possibly save the life of my ally in turn. Since two masons are now pushing the card, I fall back and attempt to defend it. After the parry, I wait for a panic response, hit him in recovery and follow up with an overhead. That finishes him well in time before the riposte hits me. I don't notice Sani until I've already ended my combo, and this delays my response a little. I remember my thought process here being something like, I am low on HP and scared of getting traded, so I'm not gonna attempt to attack him. Instead I'll just feint to slow him down and prevent him from hitting my teammates. I think the principle of stopping his momentum and slowing him down is good in a lot of ways, and since attacking him straight up potentially results in a riposte that damages my teammates anyway, forcing out a parry is a better way to go about it. But I also feel like I'm stating the obvious when I say I should follow up on this feint instead of waiting around for him to get out of recovery. I parry really early in response to his overhead, and have to say I was genuinely surprised it managed to connect. I proceed to spice things up with a reverse overhead that misses. When he gets fed a riposte from my ally, I have no choice but to feint to parry, no matter how far into my attack I've come. He can't be flinched in this act, which means I die even if I hit him first. My Van ally goes for the almighty LMB, and this is where my involvement in the fight ends. First, let's talk about the good things. There's no huge positioning error to talk about. I actually avoid getting sandwiched completely, and still manage to stay active and capitalize on my enemy's mistakes the entire time. I also play my defense quite well, with many successful parries and a good feint to parry effort. Ultimately, this leads to me not taking a single hit from my enemies. Instead, I take some bruises from my allies and a fair bit of burn damage, which when added together results in a lethal dose. But this fight also has a very strong element of awkwardness to it, due in part to the excessive misses from the spear guard I was fighting, the long distances and time delays between hostile encounters, but mostly it's because of misplays on my end, like failing to follow up on my successful feint, and more importantly the awful amount of misses throughout the engagement. A good aim may not be the most sought after trait in a medieval first person slasher, because the skill ceiling in that regard simply isn't that high. But that is not to say you can't completely ruin your performance with a couple of key misses, especially in team-based combat, where your opponents on average pay less attention to you, and in turn are less likely to safety parry the times you end up missing. Moving on to an engagement that took place in the valley. I start my attack slightly too early, but since he doesn't swing in my direction, I'm free to follow up and kill him with my subsequent stab. As I run him through, I sense the knight approaching from the cart, and immediately move away from him to avoid getting hit. After his second slash he goes into recovery and I score a good hit on him. Here I lose a bit of my tempo by safety parrying, and it could have been a good time to duck his strike instead. I would have been free to hit him afterwards, which would have led to his death. But the bigger mistake comes after. I wind up for the knight, but do a desperate switch when I see the incoming vanguard. The overhead is badly out of reach of him, and only works towards emptying my stamina. Hitting the knight instead would have been slightly wiser, but the best course of action would be to stay my weapon and attempt to dodge the charge safely. I end up dodging the charge anyway, and land a hit on him in the process, but it puts me in striking distance of the still breathing knight, who taunts me from behind with his messer. This could have been avoided entirely. At least I'm happy to say I capitalized on the subsequent miss and delete him from the fight afterwards. The next target serves himself up on a silver platter, running into me with throwables drawn. While I could continue and stab him directly after, I choose to go for Sunny on the left instead. By switching to Sunny, I allow these guys to live on, and there is a high risk of him parrying me anyway. This would break my momentum, and leave me with just as many enemies as I started with. Now, if this was a low skill player instead, I would definitely advocate for switching to him, as he would be very unlikely to parry, and it would be one of the more opportune moments to score a free hit. I could also do this without any fear of getting hit by anyone else. But in the actual situation, I have no real preference. I made a decision and it turned out well, but I would not necessarily say it's the best one. If I had stabbed this guy instead, I would most likely have killed both him and his companion. Two guys just ripe for the taking. I also think it very likely I would be able to see if TP and parry Sunny afterwards as well, coming out of it unscathed. Luckily for me, Sunny fails to parry, and the rest of this fight is just smooth sailing. Here I managed to utilize my high damage and reach well. The important thing is that I always remain out of reach, so I don't have to waste time on safety parries. The van charges at me from too far away, and I capitalize on it with a stab, but I leave him to the clutches of my comrades afterwards. The fight continues in the same manner for a while. Again I refrain from attacking because the risk of hitting my teammates is a bit too high. After the safety parry I wind up, with the intention of forcing out a parry from him. Since he does the same thing, I wait for quite a while before following up on my feint, and really make sure he cancels his stab first, because I'm afraid of getting traded in the middle. This delays my second stab long enough that he gets out of parry recovery, and parries my attack. And while this is a good precaution, a better player would have utilized his feint more efficiently. That said, he dies shortly after anyway. As I turn around I spot Urti and another Mason Knight making their way towards us. and I'm stupid enough to think that his stab is out of reach of me. So I try to hit him mid-combo, but get flinched almost immediately, and put down to about 10 HP. I continue to safety parry his next stab, and this turns out to be quite detrimental to my tempo. But it wasn't until the very last moment that he target switched from me to Intox, so I can't really blame myself for this. Again he seems to stab in my direction, and again I parry nothing. The third time he stabs, it finally connects, and I respond with a simple overhit. After his riposte, I make an attempt to fend off the Poleaxe Knight, but despite my earlier wind-up, his movement in combination with mine results in an excessive drag from me. And even though I hit him first, he's already in release by then, and has enough HP to chain me to death. Overall, it was quite a successful fight for me. I managed to capitalize on a lot of mistakes done by my enemies, and played my part well when we had a numbers advantage, by continuously pumping out attacks on my enemies, and staying my weapon when too many allies were around. But towards the end I made a lot of mistakes, most notably failing to parry the initial Sword of War stab. I had a lot of time to do so, and if only I had managed to do this one thing, my HP would have been a lot higher. I could have responded immediately with a riposte, drag or feint. Intox most certainly wouldn't have died, and we could all have ganged up on these two guys with a good chance for yet another victory. The safety parries aren't as much my fault, but they contribute to quickening my doom all the same. My overhead response after the first successful parry is super weak, and brings me no closer to getting out of there alive. Not in theory, nor in practice. I haven't primed my opponent at all to overread standard overheads, and since he's a pretty good player, it's stupid to believe this would have any effect at all. The tree in between us gives me a perfect opportunity to circle around, force him to chase me and then quickly turn with a feinted attack that could lead into a free target switch onto the second approaching knight. This would serve the benefit of controlling both of my opponents, while damaging one of them and priming the other for future failed parries. My overhead on the Poleaxe Knight may have worked out, but thanks to poor mouse work yet again, it hits him too late in release and fails to flinch him. I think I got a bit too nervous after the Sword of War stab, that I would not dare make any plays at all, and that resulted in a couple of very meekly responses the few times I were allowed to attack. It's about time we got our feet wet and looked at a fight in the cistern. Let's watch it carefully first and then talk about the countless mistakes. I arrive at the scene only to find out that nigh on the entire Mason team also happens to be there, so it is a bit of a suicide mission from the start. But I save myself a bit of time and trouble by making sure the knight closest to me isn't going to engage me before I jump down and try to help my team. My initiation is probably the stupidest you'll ever see. For one, the slash does the least damage of the 3 attacks to a Vanguard, and should be replaced with a stab. Secondly, there's a giant fucking pillar in the way, and again the attack most likely to be blocked by this is a standard slash, so why I choose to go for this is absolutely beyond me. Here I finally choose the right attack for killing Vanguards and manage to do so. But what I should actually do is to turn my attention towards this knight instead. Both of the Vanguards are well inside Intox's field of view, and the best way to protect her is to attack the guy she cannot see. Since I decide not to, she's left open and dies to him while I stab the Vanguard to death. And while it sounds like I hit the van by the cart as well, I do in fact not, and we end up trading hits on my subsequent slash for that reason. After parrying his stab, I overdrag my overhit, but luckily he dies for the next stab in the combo. At this point I can hear someone attempting to hit me from behind, and jump forward while I turn around to try and locate him. This is typically a good way to reposition, while maintaining the ability to parry. I'm unable to see the stab in time, but after that I'm at least smart enough to ignore the Poleaxe Knight swinging out of reach of me, and focus on parrying the barges on my right. The riposte is my key out of the here situation, and I get off a nice 3-part combo that kills both my attackers. Since I've just killed 2 of his friends and received backup in the process, this knight should be quite desperate and likely to make mistakes. I run in aggressively despite my stamina shortage, and stop as soon as he swings to hit me in recovery. I try to bypass his next parry with an overhead feint, but while he does fall for this, my next reverse is a bit too hasty. I proceed to mess up my footwork, and even though I'm well aware of the approaching vanguard, I strive towards him to avoid the messer. Because I place myself in between the 2 of them, but I can't keep them in my field of view, and make sure to put my parry in recovery by dodging the messer with movement instead, I have no chance to parry the vanguard stab, and die to it as a result. Had I just backed out the other way, I could have parried the knight's attack and moved away from the vanguard, and possibly responded with a riposte or something of the like afterwards. The by far biggest mistakes were made in the opening of the fight, when I messed up 3 hits and chose targets poorly. I could have easily killed off 2 of them and prevented Intox from dying altogether, then proceeded to take on the rest of the masons from a position of power. And that wraps up the most recent installment in the Combat Analysis series. This game too eventually ended as a defeat, but we're all winners in the grand scheme of things, learning from and growing ever wiser due to our past mistakes. Besides that, I don't know much more to say. I would just like to thank you for watching this episode of Combat Analysis. I hope you enjoyed and where possible even learned something. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more of these, and if not, maybe we'll just meet on the battlefield instead. That is where the real magic happens after all. Alright, Fergus out.